Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison. I serve as president of 1615, where I also serve as a church missions coach. Now, before we begin today's webinar, as always, we want to take a few moments and let you know about some resources, as well as some upcoming events. If you haven't read our book, When Everything is Missions, we highly recommend that you do. We address this idea that everyone's a missionary and everything done in Jesus' name is a missions work. Are those biblical ideas? Are they helpful? Do they lead to more missions work being accomplished or less? So this book will help church and ministry leaders clarify what the mission of God is, what is the mission of the church, and in fact, is every Christian a missionary? You can buy it at wheneverythingismissions.com. I co-authored this book with Denny Spitters, and we've been just amazed at how far its reach has gone. And so we hope you took advantage of this important resource. And then we have a follow-up book called Conversations on When Everything is Missions. And this time around, more than 15 contributors, such as David Platt, Ed Stetzer, and others, have added their voices to this very important conversation. So you can also pick that up at wheneverythingismissions.com. Let's see, you can buy the books individually, or I believe there's a bundle deal. So please hop on to that website and check out those resources. We also have a podcast entitled When Everything is Missions. We have 3 seasons available, and we're rolling out more of those even right now. Wherever you get your podcasts, please subscribe to that, like, and this season you'll be hearing from the authors of book 2. So please take advantage of that resource as well. And wow, I love this resource here. We launched something several years ago called the Mission Table. And the idea behind the Mission Table was that many churches weren't doing missions well because they had not thought about missions well. So we like to say that the Mission Table has poor thinking about missions in its crosshairs. We bring together leading missions thinkers and practitioners, and we tackle some of the most critical, controversial topics impacting missions today. Seasons 1 through 3 are available, and we are preparing to record some new episodes here soon. So please take advantage of that resource, missiontable.org. We also have a vast webinar library. We've been recording webinars since 2011. Today's webinar will also be recorded and will eventually be available for viewing at our website. But there's an array of Great Commission topics, inspiring global engagement for your churches and ministries, and we have featured noted speakers. And many of our speakers are actually our partners. So you can go to 1615.org/webinars, or you can just click on the resources button at the top of our homepage and you'll navigate to that place. We have a couple of podcasts. I mentioned When Everything is Missions already. Here's another one, the Mission Matters podcast. This is a podcast that is done in partnership with Missio Nexus. And the idea behind the Mission Matters is that the mission matters. It's the most important thing happening in the world today. And so we talk about that, but we also talk about the matters of our mission. It's available on 10 podcast platforms. For a full list of those platforms, visit that web address right there, anchor.fm/mission-matters. Also available on YouTube, or you could just put in Mission Matters Anchor, do a search, and it'll take you there. We have a resource that we're very excited about. We launched it at the end of 2019, pre-pandemic, the Mobilize Church Workshop. It's a regional 2-day workshop. That was the original format, where we think about what a mobilized church actually looks like. And we dig into Acts chapter 13, where we read about the very first church that had global vision and strategy in the New Testament. And we draw out 7 keys that were present in Antioch and unlocked their potential. And they are in fact the same keys that are unlocking missions potential of churches today. We have several ways that we now deliver the Mobilized Church Workshop, live regional events. Our next one will be in Dallas this fall. We also have a 2-day online virtual and an 8-week online virtual. And don't worry, we don't have you online for 8 straight weeks. It's 90 minutes, 1 night a week for a period of 8 weeks. It's supplemented with videos. To learn more about that, please visit 1615.org/TMC, or again, just go to our homepage and navigate to events and resources. We also have some upcoming webinars. You can get on our Website to find out more about those: Mobilizing People of Color, African Americans. That's a series we started last year. We also have a few coming up on Latino Americans and Asian Americans as well. We have one on essentials for fundraising and development for mission agencies. And then this very important one, the reboot of short-term missions, which is of course critical right now as we see the church and the world coming out of this COVID era. What will short-term missions look like? So please get on our homepage or go to our events page to learn more about those. Well, today's webinar is going to be focusing on, as you know, the characteristics of church honoring missions organizations. And before we dig into that topic, I want to talk about the priority of mobilizing churches. So in my nearly 25 years of missions mobilization, I have encountered many people inside the mission agency world who know that biblically local churches have a key role to play in world missions, but practically speaking, they would rather local churches just provide money and people and kind of get out of the way so the agencies can get the job done. Now, I know that's not true of every mobilizer in the agency world or church partnership person inside the agency world, but I've heard that repeatedly. For some folks in the mission agency world, I've discovered that working with churches is not something they desire or something that actually brings them joy, but it has to be done, so they do it somewhat begrudgingly. Now, let me say, I can relate as someone who's been working with churches in mobilization for quite some time now. I'm aware of that. To be sure, churches with whom we are all familiar embody various levels of imperfection, just like our missions organizations. But here's the thing. This does not alter the magnificence of God's original design. On the contrary, what it does, it provides a backdrop that highlights the breathtaking dimensions of God's grace in the face of human waywardness. Don't you love this fact? God is going to build his church. He's going to perfect his bride. She will, in fact, complete the work that he gave her to do. So as missions mobilizers inside missions organizations, or maybe you represent the church partnership divisions of your organizations, here's the thing. We have this amazing privilege of loving, nurturing, teaching, and leading local churches into the exalted role that God has for them. What an honor that we get to mobilize the people of God to be a part of the mission of God. So I think it's important agencies consider these questions. We're not going to jump into these right now, but if you haven't addressed these questions inside your organization, I would encourage you to do so. Why should agencies prioritize the mobilization of local churches? Do you believe there's actually a biblical basis for agencies to work with and mobilize them? And then another question, I think, again, this is a great thing to bring your leaders into at your organization or your teams. What are some practical reasons why we should be seeking partnership with local churches? I think it's really important that you address the why questions. So I want to look at Hebrews 13, 4 and 5 as we get into the priority of mobilizing churches. On my wedding anniversary a few years back, I journaled some thoughts. That's something I actually do most days, but I'd really like to take some time on those significant days to write in a journal. By the way, I'll be celebrating my 25th anniversary next week with my wife, Renee, so I'm just thrilled about that. But I've been thinking a great deal about contentment. And so I was meditating on Hebrews 13, 4 and 5. You see it there on your screen. Let me read this and draw some parallels for us as those in the agency world and how it relates to our relationship with churches. So marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Keep yourselves free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For, or maybe your translation says because, God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So here's a bit of my journal entry. Father, when you gave me Renee, my wife, of course, you were in essence giving me some of yourself. You're giving me one of your daughters, one of your own. To not be content with her is to not be content with you. You instruct me to keep the marriage bed pure and undefiled, and to be free from the love of money. And then you say these words, you will never leave me. You will never forsake me. So to not be content with my wife, to seek my pleasure outside the marriage bed or elsewhere, to not be content with the resources you've given me is basically saying that your presence and your gifts to me are not enough. So what on earth does this have to do with mobilizing churches? Well, folks, it has much to do with mobilizing churches. So if marriage is designed by God to be this living parable that puts on display these wonderful divine realities that have to do with Jesus's love affair with his bride, the church, then I think for those of us who relate to and work with and mobilize churches, the actual bride of Christ, a person, if you will, a woman, the metaphor of marriage is profound. So hear me out here, okay? When we are not content with local churches, the metaphor of marriage helps us to orient where our heart should be. If we would rather bypass our relationship with churches to accomplish the task of world missions, might we be saying to Christ, we're not content with your plan? It doesn't really work. These churches are difficult. We're going to find another way. We're going to find another means. We're going to look elsewhere. Now, I may be reaching here, but I believe when missions organizations and agencies who are designed to be para for church, I believe when we view them simply as a means to accomplish our mission or our ends, or when we write them out of God's mission, that we defile our relationship with his bride. So why prioritize the mobilization of local churches? Well, folks, it's biblical, okay? So this passage is great. To me, though I'm the very least of all the saints, we know that grace was given him, Paul, to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ and to bring the light for everyone. What is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things, so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. So really remarkable passage there. We know that God has a glorious vision for his church. She's his bride. He loves her. He's going to make his manifold wisdom made known through her. So why? Well, of course, it's biblical, folks. We know that, right? But we need to remind ourselves of that. And then continuing on this theme, this is from George Miley. By the way, if you've not read George Miley's book, Loving the Church, Blessing the Nations, it's no longer in print. I think as those in mobilization world, you've got to read it. But he says, to say the church is an awesome resource is an understatement, possibly somewhat condescending. She's more than that. She's a God-designed central player, a full partner. So yes, it's biblical. And then Ed Stetzer in our new book, Conversations on When Everything is Mission, says this: the church is God's plan A for advancing his mission in the world. There is no plan B. So of course it's biblical. It's also strategic. This is also from George Miley. He says, as we enter the third millennium of the Christian era, there is widespread awareness that the energy and capacity of the missions movement would be appreciably enhanced if we could bring more local churches into meaningful involvement. And then he says, the vast majority of all the resources God has entrusted to his people, spiritual gifts, vocational expertise, life experience, capacity for spiritual warfare, financial reserves, etc., he has placed in local churches. Folks, think about it for a minute. Consider the aggregate resources that God has placed inside churches, big and small. Capacity for spiritual warfare, as he says, vocational expertise. These resources are in churches. So it's strategic. And John Piper hits on this as well. He says all the resources needed to send and support an army of self-sacrificing, joy-spreading ambassadors is already in the church. So one, it's biblical, but from a practical standpoint, folks, it is also strategic. And then related to that, it can increase effectiveness. I would say it can. I'm not suggesting that every partnership or every effort to mobilize churches ends in success, but it can. It can leverage resources, abilities, opportunities, giftedness, and ideas. Again, there's a whole lot of talent and resources that God has placed in churches. How do we leverage them? And then I love this too. Churches bring knowledge, insight, and creativity that protects agencies from our blind side. And it keeps us from doing things like we've always done them before. And then continuing on this idea of it can increase effectiveness, it can decrease the time frame of fulfilling a vision or mission. It might take a little longer to get started, of course, but we know that bringing those diverse resources together can decrease the time frame. It can lead to greater impact. Well, this is big. It produces healthy accountability, and it can result in shared and celebrated outcomes. Fourth reason here, love this one as well. This is a biblical reason, but because the Great Commission cannot fail. We know this promise from Jesus. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So he's going to perfect his church. He's going to fulfill his mission through his church. And then, of course, his words to Peter, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, we see in Acts 2 the inauguration of the church. It's inaugurated in a global context, as we know. But then we go to Revelation 5 and 7, and we see that the church is consummated in a global context. But we have the climax of God's story, the end of this epic story of redemption, and the church is complete, and she has fulfilled her mission. So this is another reason why we should prioritize the mobilization of churches as agencies and shouldn't go at it alone. Steve Barron, who's the missions pastor at Calvary Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, wrote these words in his book, Well Sent, which, by the way, is one that I highly recommend. But he really demystifies the church and agency partnership. And that's not to say that it can't get complicated. It must be nuanced. But I love what he says here. The church is to be the sender of missionaries, and the agency is to be the facilitator. The church has most, but not all, of the resources, and the agency has most, but not all, of the expertise. It makes sense to bring these parties together for productive ministry. It is important to know that going it alone often results in the duplication of efforts and a lack of expertise. So these are the reasons, many more, of course, I believe that missions organizations, mission agencies should prioritize the mobilization of local churches. There's another reason I believe that agencies should be focusing on the mobilization of churches, and that is the changing missions paradigm. So the missions world is changing. We've seen rapid changes over the last several decades, and of course, we've seen even more rapid changes brought on by the pandemic. But because of these changes, agencies, especially those that have been around for a while, have got to think differently in relation to how they interact with local churches. So here's a few indicators of a changing missions paradigm here. Once again, George Miley, like this, he says, mission agencies can no longer afford to do traditional missions better. They must start thinking paradigmatically differently. Now, I don't think that paradigmatically is a real word, but I really like it. So there is a massive shift going on in the missions world. The ground is shifting, and so agencies must think differently about how they relate to and work with churches. Here's one of the big changes, and this has been building over the last few decades, but there's a transition from proxy missions to personal engagement. Churches are no longer content, many of them, to serve only in support roles. What they desire is active, personal involvement. Again, I've been at this 25 years, and everywhere I go, this is what I hear, a desire not just to serve in support roles. Churches want a vital role even when sending their own people or engaging in a project overseas. They want to work with mission agencies. They're also placing a higher value on personal relationships with missionaries and partners. They're moving towards more of a relational approach to partnership as opposed to a transactional approach to partnership. Continuing on the same thought, I believe that churches want to do missions in a way that is meaningful to them, that bears their unique fingerprints and engages the unique gifts, talents, and contributions of their people. And this changes the way agencies work with churches. And I view this as ultimately a positive thing. There's a dictum here that I often use to describe this. Tell me and I will forget. Show me and I will remember. Involve me and I will understand. So this desire towards personal engagement leads towards greater ownership. And when a church owns their vision to reach the world, they're going to invest in it far more significantly. If they don't own it, they're not going to invest in it. This is related to the previous idea, but I'm focusing here more on resources. There's a transition from outsourcing to partnership. And so many churches no longer perceive missions as simply sending resources to agencies, which for a long time was primarily what they did. They were sending people and money, but they don't view missions that way anymore. And I've discovered there is increasing hesitation from churches to work with agencies that only provide opportunities to fund what the agencies instigate. So in other words, if an agency only has offerings of money, end of story, but there's no opportunity for the church to have a seat at the table and to be a part of the ministry and a part of the conversation, I find that churches are pushing back on those old paradigms. Simply put, churches are not ATMs, and we all know that. But I think in the past, sometimes that has been the perception or perhaps the optics. There's also this move from reactive to proactive, or from request-driven to strategy-driven. Again, been at this for some time now, and everywhere I go, I see an increasing frustration from churches about the shotgun approach that is really just responding to requests for funding without an intentional mission in place, and they're becoming less and less interested to that with that style of doing missions. And so they're moving from this subjective reactionary approach to an objective and intentional approach. And we see this evidenced in the fact that churches are supporting less missionaries and less projects, but I find they're supporting them more significantly. So less missionaries, less projects, but investing more because there's a deeper sense of ownership. Heard this statistic a couple of years ago. It may have shifted now, but missionaries today are supported by an average of 1.5 churches, which seems like something we should lament, because a decade ago there was an average of 12. But again, what I'm seeing is they're investing more significantly, more resources, more time. There's also this move from a missionary-driven approach to a mission-driven approach. And what do we mean by that? Well, I think churches used to ask, what missionaries can we support? How much money can we allocate to our missions endeavors this year? And so it was a somewhat arbitrary distribution of finances. But this is what I'm experiencing. Churches are now first asking, what mission has God called us to undertake? Then, what projects and missionaries should we support? So they're backing up a little bit, and they're becoming more mission-driven as opposed to project-driven or even missionary-driven. And again, I believe this is a positive thing, because they're going to stay the course if they're focused on a mission. And then this is something else that I've seen, is there's a shift from missions committee, a kind of this ad hoc group of big-hearted, well-intentioned people that oversee the missions work of a church, towards more of a mission task force or team. And so again, not having a clear mission often is the case with the committee, not in all cases, but now these teams are tending to be organized around a mission or a vision. A couple more pieces here. This is a major paradigm shift. Of course, missional thinking and language are everywhere, and with that comes the promise, a promise and potential danger. So if you haven't seen it, North America is more and more like a mission field. I'm sure you're aware of that, but we have to remember it's a post-Christian rather than a pre-Christian mission field. And I think this idea of missional thinking has brought some great changes. It's called for a new missions-like engagement, and that has been significant. How do we get the church out of the building and into the highways and the byways? And that's fantastic. But this thinking also came with a massive danger, and that danger is the discussion of being missional led to everyone being a missionary. Every Christian is a missionary. We wrote a book on this, if you didn't catch that. But what happens is the pursuit of all peoples gets obscured, and the priority of engaging the least reached and unreached can actually be lost. So I think you've seen that as an indicator of a changing shift. The nations at our doorstep, this is a shift as well. And I think under a Biden administration, we're going to see more and more of this. God has brought the nations to us. And I think as agency mobilizers, we have to help churches think about the diaspora that's around them, and might they be a link to a people group overseas. However, we cannot reach the nations without going to the ends of the earth. It should be a supplement to our vision to reach the nations, for a church's vision to reach the nations, but we will not see the ends of the earth won only by focusing on diaspora peoples. I want to shift gears here. I want to talk about indicators of the changing missions paradigm from the agency's perspective. Agencies are realizing that they cannot accomplish the unfinished task with just their own resources, and that in order to finish the task, churches must be mobilized. Stephen Douglas, formerly president of Crew, he's still active with Crew, but they have a new president now. He said something profound a few years ago, and I wrote it down because it was just so impactful to me. My goodness, they're one of the largest missions organizations in the world. And he said, we've realized it is not the responsibility of agencies to do missions on behalf of the church. We can no longer simply take pride in our annual statistical growth. We must be focused on finishing the task. Again, a profound statement. So as organizations, we can't just come to the end of the year and go, wow, we've seen statistical improvement. We need to be saying, are we mobilizing the church to engage the nations? That's an important measure. Agencies are finding churches less responsive to old missions models. So a common model in the past, and I experienced this myself when I was missions pastor at a local church, but agency folks would come in and they would say, join us in our mission or join us in our vision. And I think they need to shift now and say, can we join forces in the mission of God? Can we work together? Agencies I've talked to are realizing that churches' allegiance to agencies for the sake of loyalty is no longer assured. I think for a period of time that there was this loyalty that was just a given, particularly in the denominational mission agency world. I've talked to several denominational missions who say more and more of their denominational member churches are sending funds outside of the denominational mission. So I think it shows that that loyalty is no longer assured. And another factor here, and I see this in a lot of missions orgs, they're developing church partnership teams or departments and mobilization teams, not just focusing on individual donors. So we're not going to enter into conversation here, but I think it's important for those of you online today to evaluate these changes in the context of your own organization. Do you identify with any of these indicators of a changing missions paradigm? And if so, how are you facing them? How are you addressing these challenges? And I would say opportunities. How is this changing the way that you're relating to churches? So we should be prioritizing the mobilization of churches. We talked about those things. We've talked about what's happening in the world today, this shifting going on that forces really in many ways agencies to think and behave differently. Now let's talk about the characteristics of a church honoring mission agency organization. This is why you came today. So you're going to hear 5 characteristics of organizations that I believe honor churches. The first is cherishing. So a few questions that we attach to this idea of cherishing. Does your agency or team, personnel, demonstrate a loving desire for the church? By the way, if you're looking for answers today, we're just going to leave you with a lot of questions because we think the answers you need will come as a result of asking these questions in your own context here. But do you demonstrate a loving desire for the church? And then I would add to that, how is that love expressed? Is this a part of your culture? Now, let me give you one example that 1615 has incorporated in our desire to be a church honoring agency. So when I'm pulling into a church parking lot, going to be doing some teaching or consulting or coaching, whatever it might be, I surface Acts 20:28, which is that reminder from Paul that the blood of Jesus Christ was the cost for purchasing his church. Now, he's addressing shepherds, and he talks about shepherding the church of God, but then he says, these sheep were bought with blood. And so every time I set foot on a church's property, now I realize the church is not a place, it's a people, but we do have these outposts and buildings. And I remind myself, the people I'm interacting with today were people that Jesus bought with his blood. How am I going to treat them? How can I minister to them corporately, individually? And when I leave the property, when I leave them today, will they have this idea? That was a blessing. 1615 blessed us today. So just a simple example of how you can incorporate something into your culture that says we cherish the church. There's a lot of ways you can do this, of course. Listening. My goodness, this is a huge one, right? Do you project at your organization, in your mobilization teams or your church partnership teams that interface with churches? Do you project a posture of inquiry and a listening ear, or is your approach agenda and answer driven? So I mentioned earlier, I was a missions pastor for 10 years, and we went through a major paradigm shift ourselves from doing that shotgun to becoming more focused, of moving from a really marginalized role in missions to a central role. And one of the reasons that happened, frankly, is I was on the receiving end of so many requests for funding for organizations. We were a large church, and so we were a target. But I would tell you, I would set up these meetings with these missions orgs, representatives, and the moment I see these folks, they're dropping the brochure on the desk, I'm getting the pitch, and I hear about their vision. And so you can see the difference between the posture here, these two people. Do you look like the guy on the left that's, agenda and answer driven, or is your posture more open and a listening ear? So this is really essential. When you interact with churches, practice appreciative inquiry, ask questions. Don't come in with answers. Ask them about their vision currently. What dreams do they have to impact the world? Find out who they are, where they're going, and I think you'll find that you might end up surfacing something where there might be an alignment for partnership. So listening. Praying. Is prayer for churches part of your organization's rhythm? Is it part of your church's culture? And so I would say, again, those of you in the missions mobilization divisions of your organizations or church partnership teams, those of you that interface directly with churches, do you have prayer for churches that is a part of your rhythm and your culture? And how is this displayed and valued? So I'm going to say some really kind words about a great partner, Pioneers. They may have some folks online today. But one of the things that stands out to me in the ways that they've made this part of their culture, when you go to Pioneers, they've got video screens displayed throughout the facility. But on those video screens, they highlight every week, I believe, a church partner. And you have faces and names and a couple of prayer requests. So if you're a part of Pioneers, during the course of that week, you're going to see reminders to pray for that church partner, to learn a little bit about them. And so they've made that part of their rhythm. Something we do at 1615. It's been just such a blessing to us. We send out postcards. So the churches we have partnership with and work with, we rotate, we roll through them through the course of a year, through our electronic Rolodex, if you will. And we just send a note that says, thank you. We remembered you by name today. We called out to God on your behalf, and just it's a huge blessing. So how do you make prayer part of your organization's rhythm? Again, prayer for churches. So a few quotes here just to reinforce this. You want to see breakthrough in your relationship with churches, pray. Prayer does not fit us for the greater work. It is the greater work. And I love this one from E.M. Bounds. Every mighty move of the Spirit of God has had its source in the prayer chamber. If you want to see the needle move in the quality and depth and the effectiveness of your relationship with churches, then folks, pray for them by name, by church, the contacts you have at those churches, and let them know we are praying for God's blessing on the work of your hands. Contextualizing. Do you use the same principles of contextualization practice on the field with churches in the US? And what protocols and activities would reveal your contextualization practices? So I know that missions orgs, in particular sending organizations or organizations that have partnership with indigenous national churches in field, they place a high value on the role of those churches. In fact, they're really careful not to relate to them in a way that would minimize that field church's role. We know that we don't want to obscure them. We don't want to do for them what they should be doing themselves. And so we're careful to make sure that we don't have this colonialistic mindset, if you will, in how we relate to churches, because we know, again, in field, because we know that when we do for them what they should be doing themselves, that it ultimately hurts them. Well, here's what I've discovered. A lot of organizations, if they would simply practice the contextualization skills that they use in field with churches in the US, that they would have improved relationship with churches domestically. Listening, being empathetic, all the things we've talked about already, placing yourself in their shoes, and again, not doing for them what they should be doing themselves. And finally, investing. The fifth characteristic here of a church honoring agency. What are you willing to risk and extend to the local church without the expectation of a return on investment? Now, I know this is a tough one because we all have light bills to pay. We have payroll to meet, all those things. And ultimately, we need to have partnerships that are a win-win, and ideally in relationship with churches, that should eventually lead to revenue into our organizations that allows partnership to take place for the expansion of the kingdom and the benefit of both the agency and the local church. But if we have this posture with them where they think that we're relating to them so that we can so they can help us meet our year-end goals or expectations or metrics, it's not going to bode well for us. So here's what I have to say, question-wise. Does the pathway you have with churches contain a quid pro quo expectation and communication? Like, I'll do this for you if you do this for me. Again, I want to be clear here. It should be a mutual benefit in a partnership. But I think we need to go into these relationships saying we're going to extend something without the thought of a return on investment. We want the relationship to be a priority, and we don't want them to think we're involved in this simply for a transaction here. So here they are, characteristics of a church honoring agency. Cherishing. How do you cherish the bride of Christ? How do you demonstrate love? Listen. Are you listening? Are you practicing appreciative inquiry, learning about them? Are you praying for them? Is this a part of your culture? Contextualizing. Are you practicing those skills that you use in field when you work with, national indigenous churches? Are you practicing those things domestically? And then are you willing to invest without the thought of what's it going to bring to our organization? Again, caveat here, a good partnership should be a mutual win. So just in summary here, I would say here's 3 questions again. I may have given you more questions than answers today, but I would ask, how do you steward your relationship with the bride? Something to think about as an org. This is a big one. What type of reputation does your organization have with churches? Boy, if you got the nerve for it, ask the churches you work with. Would love to know what your perception of us is. What type of a reputation do we have with your church? And then thirdly, does your organization have a transactional or a relational posture with churches? So this comes from perspectives on the world Christian movement, but as you think about cultivating a church honoring culture, here's the point. You need to be deliberate about your values. So unless you deliberately press your values to be in alignment with your vision, you end up losing your vision because lesser values and cultural habits of the heart prevail and your vision eventually fades. So you have to be deliberate and intentional if you want to see these church honoring characteristics present in your organization, and be aware as you make them present, you might rub up against some lesser values and cultural habits of the heart that are actually anti-partnership with churches. So deliberate is the word here. In a nutshell, you're not going to get a church honoring culture accidentally. It's going to be the result of intentionality and being purposeful. So I want to shift gears here. We normally don't do this, but we're going to do a commercial for 1615 here. We developed something a couple of years ago called the Mission Agency Consultation, and it was developed in response to our agency partners. We're an independent mobilization organization. We have no field initiatives. And so when we come into a church, we have this posture of impartiality. And as their vision emerges, we then connect them to agencies that we work with that are church honoring and that have a value proposition those churches need. Well, in the midst of having those partnerships with agencies, we had requests. Can you help us understand local churches better? Can you help us develop more meaningful, more effective partnerships? And so we developed in response to that, the Mission Agency Consultation. The Mission Agency Consultation will take, David, yeah, out there, David Jacket, if you're online, jump on board right now. The Mission Agency Consultation will take place. Can you give them some details about it?
Yeah, so we're planning a mission agency consultation in the Dallas-Fort Worth area on June 2nd and 3rd. This is something that we've gotten a lot of feedback on. Again, we've done 2 of these before, but it's been a couple of years. And with COVID, a lot of agencies are rethinking things. A lot of churches are as well, but a lot of agencies are taking this opportunity to take stock and really evaluate their culture and what they're doing. And that's a great thing. And so we've had organizations ask us about doing this again. And so we feel like Dallas is a good central location. There are a lot of agencies based in Dallas, but it's also an easy place to fly into if you're interested in coming in from somewhere else. Now, again, I know that Texas has been in the news a lot. We're not cowboys out here. Everyone's being very careful. We do realize that the COVID is still a reality, and we're making plans for that. But we do still think there's a way to gather together in person, which I think most of us are longing for, but also do it in a way that's safe. So it'll be 2 days here in the Dallas area. We've got a couple of location options. We haven't nailed that down, but it'll be in the Dallas area. And we've got a website. Matt can show you the website link. Registration will open up next Monday. And obviously, if he's going to talk a little bit more about it now, but if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or reach out to me. Registration will open on Monday. We've got it will cost $375 per person. That covers your meals, your snacks, coffee, materials, things like that. And then also we tried to do a group rate. So if you bring 8 people to a table, we wanted to kind of give a little bit of a group rate if you're able to bring a team. Obviously, and I don't know how much Matthew will go into this, but really what we hope to see is anyone within your agency that interacts with churches or influences culture. So that can be almost everybody. But you really want to make sure you bring the right people. Your mobilization team, I think, is crucial, as they're the ones that are probably dealing with churches on a regular basis. Or if you have a church partnership department that's separate, you would definitely want to bring them. But I also think it's vital. Some of the feedback we've heard from agencies in the past have said, I really want my leaders, the ones that are really steering the ship, to be at this next time, because they're the ones that we really look to influence culture and cast vision for who we are and why we do what we do.
Yeah. So David's kind of hit on who should come. I will tell you, it's a deep dive into those 5 characteristics. And it really emphasizes how do we cultivate these qualities throughout our organization, and in particular, those groups that are interacting with churches, with, again, the importance of this something that leaders own in the church. Very interactive. It's not a talking head conference. It's not a preach-a-thon. There'll be short 25, kind of 30-minute TED-style talks on various topics that are related to this. How do we become a church-honoring organization? And then there's breakout times in orgs. There's some exercises we do, design thinking. We do some empathy mapping. One of the biggest impacts that we've heard from agencies is trying to generate an understanding of how churches perceive us. How do churches view us? So we've got a great exercise that puts them in basically the shoes of a local church, and it sheds some light on, again, how churches might view them and how they need to shift the optics and the perception of that. And then you'll leave with a plan. How do we begin to cultivate and embed these qualities in our organization? I do have a guest online, Rebecca, who came to our first MAC, and I've got a few questions for you, Rebecca. I'm going to turn on my camera. You can do the same. And then we're going to open it up for some general Q&A, but I want to make sure we talk to you first. It says people can see me. Can they see you?
Hi, everybody. Hey, Matthew. Good to see
Hey,
you.
Rebecca. Thank you so much for being with us today. So who are you?
That's a great question. I'm Rebecca, as you can see by my name right there. So I'm the Director of Mobilization for Cafe 1040. It's a organization based in Georgia. We have a big office in Texas also, and we are strategically focused on mobilizing the emerging generation to engage with unreached people groups through a missions mentorship opportunity overseas.
Awesome. So Rebecca, question I have for you is, why did Cafe feel a need to participate in the MAC? I imagine there was things going on, forces, situations that you said, that's important. I'm just curious, what were the dynamics at play that made you say this was a worthwhile investment?
That's a great question. I attended back in 2017 and I was fresh on staff. I think I'd only been on staff for about a year. And I had a lot of questions about how we work as an organization with the local church. So because it was a felt need for me just to have clarity and what it would mean to actually work alongside the local church, I decided to squeeze my budget a little bit and attend, honestly, because I value the church internally, but I didn't know how to honor her externally. And that's why I wanted to go. And I knew just from my time at Cafe that 1615 has a great reputation for bringing clarity to churches in their mobilization and missional engagement processes. So I had a lot of hope for me as an organizational representative.
Well, I'm glad we didn't let you down, Rebecca. You were such a great addition to the conversation there too. I think that's another factor, getting agencies in the room together to cross-learn and talk about what it means to work with churches is a benefit. So I'm wondering if you had any aha moments, any meaningful moments of learning?
I did. I think thinking back, almost 4 years ago now, good grief, that there were two distinct moments that like still stay with me today. The first one is I'd heard the phrase before, have a high view of the local church, but before going to MAC, my understanding of this phrase, I would say it's like looking through foggy glasses. Like I kind of understood it and I appreciated it. I understood as organizations, we don't want to, blame the church or speak ill about the church, but I think so many organizations, they say publicly that they have a high view of the church, but we really haven't taken the time to like pause and examine every layer of our internal and external processes, and then ask ourselves, do those processes and our traditions even reflect a high view of the church? So often we've not even tried to do that. That was a big moment for me, taking this philosophical concept and really laying it across my organization. That the second moment for me, Matthew, was you mentioned it just a second ago. I was hoping you would, but the empathy mapping was really helpful. I had not done that before. But you guys did a lot of very practical exercises where we had time in the space of MAC to apply what we learned. So the exercise, I think you called it at the time, Chuck Church. So we really had to consider, like in full honesty, what the church thought of us. You guys created a really safe space for us to be pretty transparent as organizational representatives. And so we had a moment to just strip away pride in how we thought we had worked with the church and just to be honest. So it was both really humbling and refreshing for me.
Yeah, it's great. Other side of MAC. So you went through it, couple of aha moments, but I'm wondering, did it influence culture? Have there been any positive outcomes that have led to deeper relationship with churches?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. That's that's probably why you asked me to to speak today. But the longer answer is when I went into the mission agency consultation, I think I had these expectations that I would, come out with this like fully formed engagement plan. I'd be completely ready with this arsenal of like tips and tricks and tools that I needed to like have the best church engagement plan. But what I walked away with was different, but so much more than that. Before you start building or even reforming your church partnership strategy as an organization, then you have to start with the foundations of having a high view of the local church at every level of your organization. We had not done that before. We have done that now. I've had a chance to draft a document, sit down with my entire executive leadership team and look at, if we say with our mouths that we have a high view of the local church, is that reflected in what we actually do in our hiring and our sending of workers and our engagement with the next generation and our mobilization of local communities? If you don't have that solid foundation, everything you build on that in terms of church partnership strategy is going to be weak and shaky. I know there's some great, biblical principles about having a solid foundation that you can refer to later. But really, like what changed for us is how we relate to churches.
Yeah, I'm really encouraged to hear that. I think a lot of people would come to something like this and they would like this packaged, here's the plan for church engagement, here's the metrics, here's the measures, here's all those things. But really, what the MAC is about is the heart.
Yeah.
Do we truly possess a heart that honors local churches, that views them, as Smiley says, God-designed central players and full partners? Peter Drucker, famous for saying, culture eats vision and strategy for breakfast. So you can
Yeah.
have a church engagement vision and strategy, but if there's not a culture that the bride feels esteemed, it's not really going to work. It's going to be limited. So I'm glad you brought that up, because this really is about cultural transformation. Now we get practical. What are steps we need to take going back to make sense of this? What are the implications? But it's really about a plan to develop a church honoring atmosphere within, like you said, internally and externally. Because a lot of orgs speak church, they
We're
speak
very
partnership,
good at speaking
but then
church.
but then you interact with some of their folks, and you're like, wait a second here. So I'm really glad you said that. So I'm gonna be, direct here. Why should agencies come to the next MAC?
Yeah, that's a great question. Matt gave me I want to speak directly to the organizations around here. Matt gave me eyes to see the church for who she really is,
Hmm.
and who Cafe 1040 is in relationship to the church is so vital to our effectiveness in the kingdom and in the world of mobilization. It is worth the time and investment if you are serious about having an organization-wide healthy posture toward the church that's going to lead you into really fruitful church honoring partnerships. If you just start implementing resources or short-term trips or fun programs or even mini conferences for churches without having serious and intentional and thoughtful discussion about how you'll work with the church, that you really need to go. So we are, I'll just say one more thing, y'all. We are stewards of the resources that God has given us in the missions world, right? So this includes the precious human resources of the church. And it includes stewarding relationships with those who have been called this high calling of leading the local church pastors. We have to be humble, gentle, and kind, and it starts with a cultural change, and that starts at MAC. It started for us at MAC.
Rebecca, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's good to
You're a
be with you
blessing.
guys.
Yeah, you're a blessing. So I have to tell you folks, one of the things that we emphasize with our webinars is we're not selling anything. When we have our partners present, one of the things we say is give content that's valuable, that if they never get a hold of you, they were blessed by having heard from you. And we deviate a little bit from that today, because we do believe we have an offering that represents, decades of working with churches. And we hope that agencies will lean into it and they'll benefit from it like Rebecca did. We have a few minutes left. What I want to do is open it up for any question and answer. A lot of you still online, which is a good sign. No one got offended by the invitation to come to MAC. And so in the question section, if you have any questions for me, I would love to address them. And if David's still online, we can shoot some of those questions to David, our Director of Operations and Mobilization here.
So I got a question here from Daniel. What is necessary on the missions agency side of things to have church partnerships? Our organization hasn't had capacity for church partnership, even though we know it's important.
Wow, if there's not personnel for it, yeah, that's interesting. Is the name of the organization, did he represent the name there? It'd be helpful to know what they do. He did not.
No.
Okay. So it'd be helpful to know what you do. Sorry. Any thoughts on that, David, why I look up the question here?
Yeah, I think that, even if you don't have a specific department or group of people that's targeted at church partnership, I think one of the things that we talked about that you can just start doing is praying.
Yeah.
Reminding yourselves and remembering often, this word parachurch, comes with a negative connotation sometimes, but we're all parts of the body of Christ. And so you are members of a local church, just like these local pastors represent local churches. And I think reminding ourselves of that as individuals, but also as organizations, is so important. We're not outside of the church doing something for the church. We are a part of the body of Christ, working it out in a different expression. So I think reminding that, and then again, just praying for churches in your local area. What are churches that you already have relationships with, and just begin to pray with them. One of the things I did for years, I led perspectives here in Texas, and one of the things I tried to do was develop relationships with pastors that weren't centered around perspectives. I genuinely would have coffee and lunch with some of these pastors and just talk to them about their ministry and their church and their family. And it's because I genuinely love them as brothers. And I think we do believe that, we think that way, but sometimes we get caught up in the busyness of the quotas and the objectives that we forget about those relational components. So I don't know if that was helpful.
That's good. And now I want to hit on something here that you surfaced. Again, not knowing your mission. What is it that you actually do? Because that's a big piece of it. This idea of doing missions with churches, not for them. So I would think about your mission and its expression and say, are there ways that we can connect churches, their resources, their people, blend them together with our mission so that we're working in collaboration? Any more questions you want to surface there, David?
Yeah, let's see. This comes from, sorry, I think it may be Jillian. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I work for a denominational mission agency. We have definitely been pivoting towards having an intentional rather than assumed relationship with our churches over the past several years. Sometimes, however, some of our more traditional churches are still looking for that more transactional relationship than they are used to. This leads to some conflict over how we now fund missionaries. How do we honor those churches while also honoring the direction that many of our more missional churches are moving?
Yeah, we didn't get into this. We would get into it at the MAC, but I think it's important to realize that churches are on a continuum in terms of their missions engagement. And some churches may be, on the deep end where they want active personal engagement. They want to interact in the field. They want to deploy their own missionaries. They'd be under that category that you're describing as missional. I see your question there. And I think you need to relate to them accordingly. But I think also realizing there's churches on the other end that maybe they are more traditional and they prefer a transactional model. In fact, they may not want any more than that from you. And I would say honor that. But you can still send out those prayer cards. You can still develop that relationship. But I think it's having an understanding that a one size fits, this is really important. A one size fits all approach to working with churches will not work today at all. And so within your paradigm of partnership, realize that churches are going to be in different places. And I think you meet them where they're at without overextending your capacity, right? We talked about that. I mean, you can't relate to every church the same way because of capacity issues. And we understand the pragmatism of that as well. So I would say having intuition, where's a church at? How do I figure out where they're at? And then how do I relate to them accordingly? And then what are things that we might be able to do, encourage them to make progress in a gracious way? That's a thought.
Yeah, that's good. Here's a great question. From a church perspective, how do we better link arms with agencies when most don't even connect with us on a regular basis? And I'll kind of throw this in before Matthew answers, but thanks to our good friend Steve Shadrach, I don't know if he was able to get on today, but when we launched this webinar online, he said, hey, how about we do a part 2? What does a church, an agency honoring church look like? And so kind of going both ways. So this would definitely fall under that. But Matt, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say that find out who in their world is your connection point, and that might take a phone call or two if they've not been contacting you. I would say we're a church that's that provides finances and resources to your organization, and we're really interested in talking. It's as simple as that. We'd like to spark up a relationship. And I think that call is warranted. And again, sometimes it may be difficult to find out who those touch points are. And then just express your heart that, again, if this is the case, we're really not interested in transactional stuff. Maybe you love what they're doing and you love their mission, but we'd like to have conversations, give them a feel for what you're looking for. And then I think it's appropriate to say, how does that sit with you? How do you feel about that? So I would say knock on the door, make a phone call, and open it up and let them know your posture, that you're interested in relationship. And I think their response will be telling, and it will give you probably, what the next steps should look like for you. On that note, let me just say something. You got orgs online, right? The simplest things, okay? We've done some surveys with churches about agencies before, and why they pick the agency they pick, and they're like, they're the only ones that called us back. I mean, it's just the simplest things. And so if you're an agency online and you work in the missions mobilization, division or church partnership, get a listing of all those churches. I know it's labor. Start making phone calls. Hey, this is who we are. I just want to get to know. So on the other side of that, I just want to get to know you. What's going on? How can I pray for you? And if they push off like they want, traditional, transactional,
Yeah, and Sandy, I would, this was from Sandy, reach out to us, shoot me an email, davidjacket@1615.org. Matthew and I know a lot of great organizations and a lot of reps. Maybe if we knew where you were, we could throw you at least a few names to get started. So just a shot. But last one, because I know we want to stick to our time. This comes from Stacy. As mobilizers work with individuals interested in joining your agency, what is your advice on how and when to engage their church leadership? That's a big one.
Yesterday.
Yeah.
The first question you should be asking, if someone comes to your org and says, we're interested in deployment or service, have you talked to your church? Have you expressed this desire with elders or pastors, whoever your church is governed? Now, realize, we just said churches are on a continuum. They may have a church that's totally disinterested, that just wants transactional, but getting that information will help you know how to relate to that church. But I would say immediately you need to talk to those folks, and it needs to be on them. Have you approach them? Because you know what? We're going to be talking to them because we need the validation of church leadership, I'm hoping, in order to affirm your calling to serve in our organization. So David, anything to add to that?
No, I think you're right. I think that, again, with so many things out there, right, especially with COVID, there's been CrossCon was online this year. You've got perspectives on the world Christian movement, and people hear about that from their friends and they take it. And then they begin to engage in those conversations, sometimes with instructors or agencies. Matthew, you and I both teach, so we've had those discussions. But yeah, that's always my first question too, when anyone asks me about, okay, I want to go, have you talked to your pastor? And so I think at least bring that up in the conversation right away. It may be a few weeks or a month before you get a meeting with someone and that member, but I think making sure that that you're walking alongside them from the beginning, I think will be the better route.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, brother, I'm going to let you close us out here. Any parting words, any final thoughts?
No, thanks for coming. This has been a great topic. Thanks, Rebecca, for coming. We've been really blessed to partner with Cafe 1040 and thankful for her wisdom and experience with the mission agency consultation. If you have any questions, email us. We're excited to be offering this again. And so we really do hope to see you in Dallas. So be ready on Monday morning to sign up and shoot me an email if you have any questions.
Yeah, I hope to see some of you in Dallas. Have a great day. Thanks, David. Thanks, Rebecca. And everyone, thank you for being here. A reminder, this has been recorded. Will be available for viewing here in a few days.